You got a great opportunity to lead a team and build an entire new system from scratch. A car rental agency wants to manage its fleet of cars, and the first requirement is very clear. When a customer books a car, the status of the car should be changed to booked, so the car shouldn't be available for other bookings. So you start building out your aggregates, entities, value objects, and everything shapes up pretty nicely until you realize you have a big challenge. You have two different aggregates, the car aggregate and the booking aggregate, and you need to change the state of both aggregates when a booking is submitted. But you can't simply update the car aggregate from the booking aggregate. So how do we solve this? Let's find out. Hey there and welcome to the CodeUnicals channel. The challenge that we want to solve in this video is very common. Yes, aggregates are boundaries of consistency and one aggregate shouldn't simply change the state of another aggregate. Still, this is a very common scenario in application as different puzzle pieces need to fit together. In one of the previous videos, we have looked into how we can overcome this challenge using domain services. However, in this case, we can't simply use domain services as there is no common business logic or a common business rule involved that works on two aggregates at the same time. Yet, there is something even more powerful than domain services, and that are the domain events. Before we dive into code and see how we implement domain events in our code, we need to clarify a few concepts. First of all, what are side effects? That's a very common concept. So we can imagine that we have this booking aggregate that we have discussed previously, and we have this car aggregate. Now, when we want to create a booking, we usually have to submit a form, fill in some data, and during the time we do this, that car is available for us. Now, when we hit the submit button, what happens is that the car that we want to book should, of course, be made unavailable for other customers that might want to book that. So it needs to change the state of the car. And this is what we call a side effect. In other words, it's a state change in one aggregate that has side effects in another aggregate. So how can we solve this? Well, we can solve this using this concept of events, or more specifically, domain events. Now, events in general are things that happened in the past, and therefore we name them usually with past tense verbs. The idea is like, for instance, this plane that took off at a certain point in time, and if I get a notification about this takeoff, I might need to also do something because I might need to go to the airport and wait for somebody that is on that specific plane. So it means that events are here really to help us understand, okay, something happened and other parts of the application might need to react to that. Now, when reacting to that, we usually have two different concepts of events. We have domain events and we have integration events. And believe me, the distinction here is very important. Now, domain events are designed for side effects or for handling side effects that usually happened inside the same consistency boundary or bounded context. And therefore, the idea is that we don't need to use external communications, so those events are usually handled in memory, which means that they are handled in a synchronous way. Now, on the other hand, integration events, they are handled by message brokers or service buses or things similarly like that. And this means that they are asynchronous in nature. But behind that, there's actually a very important thing because they are designed, or integration events are designed for side effects that cross the consistency boundary. So when something happened in one bounded context and should have side effects or might have side effects on another bounded context. Now, you need to know that the discussion about integration events and domain events is very opinionated, very heated, and even very dogmatic, because things are really not simple. We have to take into consideration a lot of different things, like how do we handle events, pattern of handling events, what are really integration events and what are domain events. So overall, working with events is something that's fairly complex, and therefore, of course, it also gives a lot of room to debate. Now, in this video, I want to concentrate on the most basic setup of domain events, which are in-memory events that are handled in memory and that, well, are designed for, as we defined, side effects that happen only inside the same consistency boundary. And this is our demo application in which I have modeled exactly the behavior or the concepts that we have talked about during this entire video. So we have, first of all, the booking aggregate that has a little bit of information on it, like the customer ID, the car ID, a start date and an end date, and the status for the specific booking. And then we have this car aggregate, which we have here. And once again, it's an aggregate root. So we have here the manufacturer, the model, the year, the license plate number, and very important, this availability status. And by default, when we create a new instance of this car, we set this availability status to be available. And that's exactly the behavior that we need to change, because when a booking is submitted like this one, we should also change the state of the car aggregate. But how should we do that? Because we know we cannot change the state of this car aggregate from a different aggregate, because each aggregate should be a dedicated boundary of consistency. We cannot also use a domain service because that's not a real business rule that needs to be processed, that we have like two aggregates as an input and then the logic, or we have a service that applies a certain logic to them. So this is also not the case here. And therefore, the next thing to go is we can do this via events. And once again, events are very, very powerful. And let's start it step by step. So first of all, what I would like to do here is I would create a class that I will call booking submitted event. And here we'll need an information public int, because we'll need to specify the ID of the car so that the application knows exactly what car needs to have a state change. And that's our domain event class. Now, the next thing is that probably in our application we'll have a lot of different events, and all events or each event might have totally different properties in or as class members. And that's why there is the next challenge, that conceptually all events are the same, but they might have a different form. But conceptually I want to have in my domain this concept of a domain event, and therefore I will go to the shared kernel and I will add a new class, and I'll call this class domain event. And I will make even this class abstract. If there is the need to specify some common properties or behavior that should be applicable to all domain events in my application, that would be the perfect place where we would put that. In our case, we don't really have this concept, so we just use this domain event to have this conceptual idea that we are working with domain events, and so that we are able to identify even programmatically our domain events in our domain. So in order to kind of like update our booking submitted event, the only thing that we need to do here is now to simply go and say that, hey, we inherit domain event, and each event or any event in my domain will always inherit this domain event, and so I know exactly what are my events. Now the next thing is, okay, we have defined the event as an abstract class, then we have defined here a concrete implementation, which is this booking submitted event, but we still need to achieve two things. The first thing is to raise this event inside the domain somehow, and then the second thing is that we need to achieve is to kind of like handle that specific event. Now let's take them one by one. So in the first step, we need to kind of like a way to raise the event. Now there are different possibilities to do that. We can even create our own custom classes that we can maybe wire up through reflection so that when we raise a certain event, a certain handler is executed, but we can do this even easier. And what I will do here is I will go on the aggregate root class, and that's also a very important topic. There is some discussion here because some people like to do this on the entity class, but I think that doing this, or what you'll see just in a few seconds, is better suited on an aggregate root, because the aggregate root is the warranty of the consistency of the entire aggregate. So it should also be responsible to handle all the needed events in that specific aggregate. Now, what I will do here is I will have here a private read-only, let's make it a list of domain event. And here you see why this domain event class is important, and we'll call these events, and that would be equal to new. So we instantiate a new instance, and then what we'll have, so each aggregate root will have a public I read-only collection of domain event, and let's call this events, and this will actually be events like this. And this is a way in which each aggregate will have this collection of domain events. So then we can add the next behavior on our aggregate root, and this is the possibility or the behavior for aggregate roots to add or to raise events. And the way that we'll do this, once again, it's very pragmatic and very simple. There might be even more complicated approaches, but that would do it in most of the cases, I would argue. We'll have this public void raise event. So it's just a method that takes in a domain event, and we'll use event as a keyword. And since it's also a C# keyword, I will also use this at the beginning. And the only thing that we'll do here in this method is simply go to the events and we'll add the new event that we just got in. Okay, so this is how we raise the event inside the domain. And then we can go to the next step, which is, okay, how do we actually want to handle these domain events? And here there is really an important distinction to take into consideration. So raising the domain events is of course the responsibility of the aggregate, because the aggregate is the place where we apply logic, and that logic might cause side effects, so we need to raise events. So that's definitely the place where we need to do that. However, in handling the events, we will be probably forced to kind of like use at least a database connection to get an aggregate from the database and then apply the side effects that we want or that we need to apply to that specific aggregate. And therefore, as the database connection is involved, it means that we cannot implement the idea of handling events at the domain layer, but instead we need to implement that idea at the application level layer. So let's go over there and take a look on how we could do that. So here we are in our application layer, where we also have this submit booking command, which takes in some data, and we have of course the submit booking command handler, and we have a basic implementation of what we want to do in this handler. And in this basic implementation right now, we just create a new booking and we use the booking repository. By the way, in this project right now, I just use abstractions, so it's not really implemented, but the idea is that we create a booking and then we use the unit of work to commit changes. As we can notice here, we don't have any logic that also changes the state of the car once a booking is submitted, and that's what we want to change. Now the question is, how should we do that? And the answer is, of course, we can also use MediatR. And MediatR has a very nice feature that's actually intended to achieve exactly what we want to do here, and this is just publish some events. In this case, MediatR calls them notifications, and define some handlers that would be responsible to perform certain actions when those notifications or events are published. And the cool thing about it is that you can have one event. In this case, we have this booking submitted event, but you could have different handlers that perform different actions when that event is published. Now, there is a downside to that, and for that downside, we need to go back to our shared kernel for just a few seconds, because we have this aggregate root, and then on this aggregate root we have this collection of events. Now these domain events right now, they don't really mean anything to MediatR, and it wouldn't know how to map them to handlers. So what we need to do here is to install, of course, the MediatR library, which I have already done, and then we just need to make this domain event implement iNotification, which is just a marker interface that allows MediatR to match a certain event to the corresponding handlers that should be available to process or to perform some logic once this event is raised. Now, once we have done that, we can come back to our application layer, because we are done with that. MediatR will know how to identify our domain event. So the next thing that we need to do is to create an event handler for this use case. And for this, I'll just specify here this set car unavailable on booking submitted. Now, here I want to say a few words, because once again, there are discussions, there are heated debates around how do we name basically the event handlers. And there are different approaches. For instance, one approach would be something to name it like on booking submitted. But the other approach that I like better, and I will also give an argument why, is to kind of like specify the action that needs to be performed in the certain handler, and then specify on which domain event that action should happen. So in this case, we have this set car unavailable, which is the action that should be implemented in the handler, and then the event on which we should do this on booking submitted. So it reads very well in English, and it's kind of like self-explanatory what this event handler is responsible to do. And this has a very important advantage, because in most cases when we raise a certain domain event, we would probably have more than one handlers that would be responsible to execute certain functionalities, because one handler would probably, I don't know, maybe for instance change the availability of the car, for instance, but another handler would, for instance, be responsible to send a notification email to the customer. So we see that it kind of like is a bad idea to put everything in one single event handler, because those are two different responsibilities. One is working with the database, the other one works with another infrastructure concern. So we would like to have then different event handlers that are targeted specific for a certain action. So we are fully compliant with the SRP principle. And I would also bring in here some code snippet that I have already prepared, and then we'll be able to walk through that. Now, what we do here is, of course, we have this set car unavailable on booking submitted handler, and we implement this identification handler similar to the request handler. And here the only thing is that we just need to specify as a generic type param what is exactly the event on which we want to execute this handler. And this is our booking submitted event. Now, when this booking submitted event occurs or is published, and when this handler is executed, the only thing that we want to do is simply use the car repository. And on the car repository, we should have a method that's set car unavailable async, and we just need to specify a car ID. And then it should know that the repository would have to implement this logic, that it should load the car. It should then change the state of the availability using the book car method that we have on the car, but that should be the responsibility of the repository. So from the point of view of the event handler, we are good to go. Now, the final step that we have to think about is, okay, how do we actually publish those events? And that's very, very easy. So what we can do here, and we'll talk about where we should raise the events and how we should do this just in a few seconds. But the idea is that what we can do here is, as we have MediatR has also an iPublisher. So we can request an iPublisher through dependency injection, and we would get this iPublisher. Now, what we can do here is then use this publisher, and here you see that we have this publish method. Now, in this publish method, we need to provide the event that we want to publish. In our case, we know that our event is on the booking class, and on the booking class we have this events which comes from the aggregate root, and in our case we know for sure that we just have one event, and in that case we say, okay, I want to publish the very first event, and I want it to keep it as simple as possible. Now, the whole thing about having a collection of events is that when a certain action happens in an aggregate, it mostly happens that several events are raised. And then we would have several events in this events collection. And in that case, we would have probably an extension method like publish events that would loop through all the collection. And for each event, it will use the MediatR to publish it. Now, what we'll also do here is we'll await the publishing, and this will publish the event. Being published, MediatR will wire it up with the handler that we have defined for that. So it means that when it is published, it will kind of like run this save car unavailable async on the repository. So this event handler will be executed. When we do this afterwards, or in the next step, we have this await unit of work commit changes async, which of course commits the transaction to the database. And here is the last very important point that I want to emphasize here. And once again, there are a lot of very heated and, well, very important discussions and debates regarding how or where exactly we should publish the events and how should we handle them. Some of the folks say that we should publish the events basically after we save the unit of work, kind of in a way that adheres 100% to this domain-driven design paradigm. Why? Because simply is that in domain-driven design, we have said that aggregates are boundaries of consistency. And when it comes to the application layer, this means, of course, also that aggregates are also transactional boundaries. So if we have a change in the booking aggregate, that's really a change on the booking aggregate, a change on itself. So we need to save it in the database. So in that case, we can just commit all the changes to the database that we have right now. But then we can add other changes, like we publish this event, the event handlers will change other things on the specific DB context. And then what we can do is we can come here and maybe run once again this unit of work commit changes async, and this will ensure that the change to the booking and the change to the car will be actually saved as two totally different and independent transactions. Now, once again, one of the key things here is that kind of like this follows the domain-driven design principles around aggregates, But on the other hand, what we end up having here is eventual consistency. Because what happens, for instance, if we save the changes for the booking, but for I don't know what reasons, the changes that we make to the car are not saved. So this will place our application, at least for a reasonable or for a small amount of time, on a state that it is not valid, because we have an existing booking for a car and the car is still available. So theoretically, if any other request would require that specific car for rental in the meantime, it will also create a booking for that same car once again. So that would kind of like bring some problems, and well, we need to think about mechanisms to keep everything clean, or to keep our handlers and our actions idempotent, and a lot of different things that we need to think about. But and that's why, of course, the advantage for the other approach is that, okay, they say if the change to the booking and the change to the car logically belong to the processing of the same command, in our case would be the submit booking command, then it's actually good, or it's better maybe, to have everything in one single transaction. And that's exactly what we had previously when we actually had this publish before the unit of work save changes. So basically it was this scenario here. And if we have this setup, in this case, it would mean that, okay, we do the changes that we want on the booking repository, but then we await for all the other changes that needs to be done in side effects, or for the side effects in different handlers. And only if everything is okay, or when everything is ready, we then commit a transaction. So in this case, all the changes to both aggregates, the car and the booking, will be submitted to the database at the same time. So if any of the operation fails, basically nothing will be submitted, and this will still keep our application, let's say, in a valid state. This being said, I guess we have summed it up with using domain. This is really a fundamentals on how domain events can bring your DDD application to the next level. Of course, there will be a lot of other videos that will discuss a lot of topics regarding these domain events, mostly all the topics that I mentioned in this video that are very, very debatable, because I guess that this discussion needs to happen, and we need to be aware the pros and the cons of the different approaches that we might have. So definitely subscribe to this channel if you haven't done this already, so that you will be notified whenever there will be new content, especially on this handling domain events in domain-driven design. But if you have any question, or if you want to get in touch with me, don't be shy and hit also the comment section and leave a comment. That would be totally appreciated. And of course, hit the thumbs up button, the like button if you enjoyed the video. This will help a lot of other viewers to also get in touch with this content and make it easier to discover for them. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.